Welcome to the 6 Conditions podcast, where we explore the science and art of great teams. Join show hosts Drs. Ruth Wageman and Krister Lowe for pithy summaries of great research being done on teams and organizations, as well as inspired and artful approaches for using those ideas to enable brilliant collaborations. Let's get today's conversation started.
Welcome back to the 6 Conditions podcast, where we're exploring the science and art of great teams. Hey, Ruth, how's it going? Looking forward to episode number 4 today, where we're going to be chatting about the essential conditions of team effectiveness. How are you?
Yeah, Krister, great to talk with you again. I'm doing well as well.
All right. Well, let's get in. We're moving on to episode number 4 here. And just before we dive in and start exploring what we call the 3 essential conditions, what's going on with you, Ruth? Anything on your mind these days as you're thinking about teams or just the larger world that we're a part of?
Yeah, yes. As a matter of fact, yes. I spend a lot of time thinking about and teaching and working with teams around collective leadership, and I've been finding myself really bothered by the perspective on what team leadership is that you get from reality TV shows, things like, to name a few, Project Runway and Top Chef and things like that, which I very much enjoy watching. I love watching people really work at their craft, but inevitably in all these shows, they take these individuals that are competing against each other and they do the team challenge.
Right.
So they form them into a couple of groups that then have to compete against each other and do some collaborative work together. So it's a terrible setup in the first place because they're competitors, but it always turns out that the losing team is going to have to lose one of their members. They're going to get removed at the end of the episode. And it inevitably is the leader of the losing team that gets sent away. And it just makes me think about, Richard Hackman and I used to talk about this thing called the leader attribution error, which is that the failure or the success of the team is attributed to the one person who was in the leadership role. And you see that play out all of the time. And it just strikes me as such it's a narrow model of leadership, because the ones that are praised are always the individuals who had their own personal vision and got everybody else to execute against their vision. They don't really think of leadership or vision or motivation as a collective function. It's rather all sort of attributed to that one individual. So that's what's on my mind.
No, that resonates
about our
a lot.
Larger context and world today.
Yeah,
and how about you, Krister?
Well, kind of just picking up on that. I think this goes to, that's the dominant model of leadership that I think pervades most societies now, right? It's mythologized, right? And I've been listening to a book recently, an audiobook called The Social Leap, and it's about evolutionary psychology and just going back to our early origins as a species, and that a lot of our adaptations as a species really were, because the environment changed, and at the core of the adaptation was our ability to team and to really collaborate. And that led to, great advances in our capabilities. But, when they talk about our evolutionary past, which most of it was in a hunter-gatherer stage, leadership was a function of the group. It was not just something that was a possession of individuals. It was more of a group function than it was an individual attribute. And so leadership was something that really flowed across the expertise in the group. And so I think it's interesting that, we're starting to come back. You hear this language around like the Spotify model of using tribes. And, we're kind of, I think, reconnecting back to some roots around leadership as something that is a function of individual efforts, but is a really requirement that starts around the group, that direction needs to be set, decisions need to be made. And that's really best done oftentimes in a distributed type of way. So I think it's kind of interesting. We're maybe coming back full circle, but the traditional management hierarchy over the last 100 years, with all its great advances and benefits, also has, I think, just codified our locking into this heroic individual leader mythology. So I think it's going to take a long time to evolve as a species. But in some ways, I kind of feel like that's our adaptive challenge now is, we have this rising wave of populism, and we just keep going back to these heroic individual leaders that just can't deliver given the complexity of the environments we're all operating in. So
Yeah, I'd like to be optimistic about that, and because there are certainly plenty of inspiring examples of collective leadership that maybe we'll get into as we continue this conversation. But what you just said, just reminds me that leading collectively and doing this collaboration thing well is really hard.
Yeah.
It's actually hard work, and it's very easy to drift back to. We just need one person to tell everybody what to do, because that feels simpler. Not good. Effective, just simpler.
Yeah. Well, this is a good place to maybe pivot into our topic for today and see how diving in more and unpacking the three essential conditions of team effectiveness may help us with these very topics that are already coming up. So, Ruth, let's start off. We like to kick off with a question. So our question to kick off this episode is, what are the best opportunities to help leaders and teams get the essentials in place? And maybe we need to just start by a little bit of a review of what are the three essentials and unpacking each of those in detail. So where should we begin?
Would you like me to do that? Take us through a quick review. Okay. Yeah. So just a reminder of what the three essentials are in brief. First and foremost, if you want to have an effective team, you have to have a real team, a team that is bounded. We know who's in and who's not. It's stable for long enough that members can actually accomplish something together. And it is interdependent. That is, people really need to work together and exchange information and other kinds of resources in order to accomplish some collective purpose. Which leads me to the second of the essentials, which I think we'll wind up spending a lot of time on today. And that is a compelling purpose. Every team needs a purpose that really matters to them and to others. So it's consequential for the life and work of others, that really will be a stretch of their capabilities and challenge them and bring out the best in their skills. And also, above all, to be clear, where members of the team really would understand what success would look like if they were to accomplish it. And then the third of three essentials is the right people. So people who have the range of perspectives and also the skills and capabilities, including teamwork skills that are needed to accomplish that purpose. So that's what we mean by the three essentials. And I think given the question that you raised, Krister, about what are your best opportunities to help leaders and teams to be sure they are a real team with a compelling purpose and the right people, it might be worth reflecting on what we said last time about these three very predictable, reliable, powerful opportunities to make a difference in teams, and the notion of this 60-30-10 rule. Yeah. So maybe I could invite you to talk a little bit about that idea of how you bring these things to life in practice at particular times.
Yeah, as we mentioned in the last episode, a lot of times we're kind of pulling teams together and not really thoughtfully going through our process of design and, getting off to a good launch and then really having the mechanisms for ongoing coaching. So, where I meet a lot of teams are teams that are already established. They're oftentimes going through some kind of change or reorganizing. And so there's an opportunity to really assess the team's design on the 6 conditions. And just over and over again, we find that some of those conditions or subdimensions are more or less in place, and that teams really can have some benefit of really tightening that up. I mean, we talk a lot, I know you and I both work with a lot of leadership teams, and one of the phenomenon we find is that leadership teams oftentimes will rate consequentiality as very high, that what they need to do collectively together, they know is really important, but they're very unclear exactly what the unique thing is that the leadership team is going to be working on together. So I find just, having those conversations really helps them grapple with, do we need to be a real team? What's the compelling business challenge or opportunity that needs us to step up as a team? And a lot of teams just haven't really had that level of clarity around it. I think there's sort of a feeling in the ether around that, but it hasn't been really crystallized, and they haven't gotten a lot of alignment. And we see that showing up when we measure teams on these things, the wide range of views, like there isn't oftentimes a consensus around these topics. So what I'm struck by, and I think this maybe links back to some of your research, Ruth, is that you found that when teams are not well designed on these 3 things, everything else you do just doesn't seem to have the effect that it could have. And what I mean by that are the enabling conditions or the ongoing coaching or the launching. Like if you try to really work with a team that has a weak foundation, just like a weak house, it's just hard to really get anywhere or get the traction you're looking for. Yeah. What about for you?
I just want to reflect again on this idea of the 60-30-10 rule and the where your most powerful opportunities are to help leaders and teams get those essentials in place, and the idea of team leadership as design. And the importance of design thinking in creating teams and organizations. So just resonating with what you were saying about teams not really having fully grappled with whether they're a real team. I see a lot of things in organizations that really are teams in name only, that the word gets bandied about a lot. And that rather than saying, what do we need a collective of people to be doing together that is a unique contribution to the mission of this larger enterprise, they just, a lot of times leaders will label something a team in order to help people to feel included, or because it's a shorthand way of saying they have something in common, but that doesn't make them a real team. And so that 60 and the 60-30-10 rule, the thinking through of what do you need a team for, who can contribute to that, how would you articulate that purpose in a way that's really clear and compelling? All of that design work, in the typical circumstances that we see, kind of needs to get revisited. It wasn't there. It wasn't done there in the first place. And not having done that creates many harder problems down the road. So just to bring that back to people's attention and in their thinking about, for those of you who work with and support teams and leaders and try to develop their effectiveness, to really to build this sort of design thinking into the practice and how you think about how to be helpful to teams and leaders.
Yeah. I've also been thinking a little bit about looking at the 3 essential conditions in the different types of teams that I'm working with. So what do we need to be a team for? In some cases, it's a team that needs to lead. In other cases, it's a team that needs to execute. In some cases, I'm working with teams where really the goal is around learning and innovating, where they don't have actually a really clear sense of what they need to create, but they need to create a space to explore those options and do some experimentation and trying different things out. So I find, thinking about the type of team I'm working with as an interesting prism to start to ask the questions around. So if we're an executing team, are we actually working on a task that actually requires us where there's interdependency, or is it best to actually break this work up into just individual tasks and then combine periodically? So I think that's kind of interesting. I've been part of teams where I think we wanted to be a team, and so we were in a team in search of a task or a purpose, rather than the other way around. I think you can get into some trouble when you start with the relationships and the people first, and then go in search of a purpose. And I think it's much more powerful. I like to steal a quote from Peter Hawkins where he likes to say, the partnership doesn't create the purpose creates the partnership. And that's a very subtle thing, but I've learned some painful lessons around that. But one of the things when I go into work with teams, I actually have them grapple with, are we a real team? I do an exercise where I have them think about, what are our arguments for being a real team, and what are our arguments for not being a real team? And let them really hash it out. And I think a lot of times, they find what the interdependent thing is there, or what it is that the business or the organization or community needs them to step up to. But just grappling with that really helps them get the clarity around it. And then you can start to think about, so given that, what would be a compelling purpose for our team, and what could we create together uniquely? And then the question becomes, do we actually have the talent in our team to accomplish that? Right. So anyway, so that's one thing that's coming up for me in this conversation. Yeah. What else for you? So you think about the different types of teams you're working with. I'm wondering if that resonates with you, that looking at the 3 conditions through the lenses of the types of teams you're working with.
Oh, yes. And, both in terms of the teams that I'm working with and the sort of things that we've seen in the research about, what influences team effectiveness. I've spent a lot of my academic career studying interdependence and where does interdependence come from, and what are the sort of antecedents or drivers of what makes something really interdependent and makes sense to be done as a as a collective task. And one of the things I was reflecting on in what you were saying there is I have worked with, as a professor, a lot of study groups and teams that come together in the classroom that are asked to form in order to do some kind of project together. And very often they come together because they're given free choice about who they're going to work with in their team. They just pick people they like and that they want to work with together. And then they're left grappling with the question of, so what are we going to work on together and how are we going to work on it? And in one of the studies that I did of classroom teams of this kind, project study groups, I was looking at their individual values and their individual assumptions about teams. And I found this really interesting pattern that when a group of people who have very collectivist values come together to do a project, they tend to define everything as a team task. So even like reading case material together, they had a preference to like sit around together and do that stuff. Or, even writing, which is not natively a collective task, they tended to do that sort of thing together. So they would create task structures that fit with their values, rather than asking the question, so, which way does it make sense to do this stuff? And same thing when a bunch of individualistic types came together to work on a project, they had a tendency to divide and conquer everything. Yeah. And so, when it came to actually putting together a project that made coherent sense, the individuals had worked so independently of each other that they couldn't create something that was genuinely coherent. So
brings me back to my graduate school days.
Yeah. So this is resonating from your own personal experience as well. But it just, just those kinds of studies and seeing how team member behavior in the absence of good design around the essentials can become unintentionally dysfunctional in certain ways about actually producing something and learning something. And learning something together. And of course, the focus of groups in a classroom really is to harvest and contribute to the individual learning and growth and development. But finding a clear and collective purpose of of something to work on in that context, as you say, that sort of learning team, that aspect of the essentials can be a real challenge.
Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about each of these a little bit more in detail, just some illustrations around working around these with teams. I mean, they all kind of are interdependent, so there's the gestalt there. So each one kind of adds some unique value, but there is some interaction between these. So I think that may be helpful for people to think about. When we start with a real team, one of the things I find is that oftentimes getting a team outside of itself, so looking at a team from outside in, from the vantage point of the stakeholders, or what's the sort of the leadership gap, or what's going on in the world that there's an opportunity to step up to, oftentimes really helps teams get kind of outside of themselves and, get beyond their silos if they're working across silos or functions, to really find something to rally around that really needs them to be a real team. And so that's one of the things I've been working with teams. And, I think of examples of bringing together groups of leaders where there's a real ambivalence to wanting the leadership team to be more than just a forum for exchanging and updating to each other, because they felt like they had so much just running their own silos. Did they really have time to make the leadership team? Was there a real need for the leadership team? And so when they had to answer that question themselves, they couldn't answer it or come to an agreement. And so, I've been in the case where I'm like, well, I don't want to go through 2 days with you guys if we don't really need to be here. I don't want to waste your time or my time. But before we do that, let's just kind of get outside of yourselves a little bit and do some stakeholder kind of work. I have different techniques around coaching, using stakeholder voices and perspectives. And a lot of times that really broadens the scope and gets them out of, this sense of urgency and their plates being overwhelmed, which really can shadow and narrow their mindsets when there may be a real larger opportunity for them to do something together that has a big impact, that not only is good for the business, but actually can elevate their own silos and their areas of work. So that's just one thing that seems to be coming up for me around the real team. And like I mentioned, just having a team debate reasons for and reasons against oftentimes just at least creates an informed discussion around whether they need to be a team or not.
I love that you do that with the team, and also the ways in which you help them to invite their stakeholders into the room, literally or figuratively, and hear from them why those stakeholders need them to be an effective team. It struck me as you were saying this, though, that I think there is a particular role in leadership teams for the senior-most leader, chief executive or business unit head, or whoever is the leader of that team, to do some work around the question of real team. Because very often those silos that you're talking about, as we saw in the leadership team's research, is driven by the way the leader has defined their individual jobs and set their individual goals, which are inevitably really challenging, very demanding leadership things that are being asked of these leaders. And the chief executive has not said, by the way, I want you to be an enterprise leader, and I'm inviting you to the leadership team table as an enterprise leader who also has the responsibility of taking care of that particular aspect of our business. But your job is really to be thinking about the whole. So there's a lot of power in that senior leader role to help the rest of the team think of themselves as a real team. And there's also quite a lot of one-to-one work that you can do with that senior leader around the question of, what are your aspirations for where you want to take this enterprise, and how can a great team help you with that? Yeah. What would a great team be doing together, consulting with you about, or jointly deciding with you about, or jointly imagining with you about, that would be so much better done by a team than one individual working alone. So that, I think, is an important coaching dialogue to have with the senior leader around, how can we be, why do we need to be a real team, and what would our compelling purpose be as so?
Yeah. Actually, one story came up, more often than not, when I do some work with teams around real team and all that, they usually find, what is the interdependence or the larger thing that really could pull them together, the interdependency. I did have one case where a team leader really wanted her group of leaders to be a leadership team, a collective leadership team, and do some transformational work across the organization. But a lot of those leaders in the session were kind of saying, we're really new to many of them are new leaders to their functions. They didn't really feel like they had their silos and their functions under control. And so what really emerged was, what they really wanted was actually a place where they could come together and provide consultation to each other, really strengthen their silos, and put off for 6 months or a year trying to do something more ambitious together as a collective. And it's interesting. I think the team leader really heard that and backed off on trying to push them to be ready for that. And so that was one case where I actually think just having the conversation really brought to the surface developmentally where that group was. And it was a really rich conversation. What they came out with was they were going to start meeting every 2 weeks for 90 minutes and bringing one of the leaders' challenges to the table and doing peer coaching and consultation around that. And I think they got a huge amount of value at it. And then sure enough, when they were ready, the platform was ready to do a broader type of collective work together. So I think that can just be a great value to create a space for a team to grapple with the real team issue.
I agree with you. I think it's a great illustration that, if the fundamental purpose of a team is the learning and development of the individual members, that is a totally legitimate and quite powerful use of teams, if you're being explicit that that's its purpose. Rather than joint decision making or task performance or the like. It can be a very powerful venue for the individuals to develop. Yeah.
So let's chat a little bit about compelling purpose. I know, there's a variety of ways of working with this. One of the things I really learned from you, Ruth, is there's a great opportunity to do a little bit of work with the team leader and enable, in the cases where there are a formal leader of the team, to enable a team leader to have the opportunity to lead, to put the stake in the ground around a compelling purpose, and then invite the team for feedback. I think in some of my previous work, before I started working with the 6 conditions, I oftentimes would default to bringing the team and the team leader together to do purpose work and kind of co-create it together. And I think the downside and the risk there was really, in some cases, not intentionally, but unintentionally undermining the authority of the leader and not really setting the leader up to really shine and succeed and kind of provide that initial sense of direction with then leveraging the intellect of the group to refine that and own it together. So I know there's different techniques. There's not a right way to do this, but that was something that's been a real shift in my work. So just earlier this week, I was with a team. We have a template we give team leaders around crafting an initial purpose, compelling purpose statement, bringing it to the team and just having a great refinement session. And I think the team appreciates that, at least is what I find.
I think so too. And as you say, I don't think there is an absolute right way to do this, but it's one of those great places to ask what's better done by individuals and what's the best way to use a team. And we've seen in the research that teams are not really good at what I would call generative creativity. So Richard Hackman drew this distinction a lot: generative versus interpretive creativity. So starting with a whiteboard and generating a compelling purpose is not a natural team task. But collective refinement, collective imagining, brainstorming material that could be part of that. Those are all great uses of a team. And as you say, there's this authority balance beam in helping leaders to use their authority to good effect and to really set the team up for success and create the conditions for them to be effective. One of the things that leaders can provide is, as you say, a stake in the ground, a kind of clarity, but then inviting the team in to refine and grapple with and make sense of that purpose in a way that they can make it their own. Right. So that allows both individual and collective to serve that purpose.
Yeah. I also have, just to play devil's advocate, I definitely also have, found some artistic approaches to doing the purpose work with teams, and whether it's drawing and coming up with a metaphor together and drawing that, or some embodiment. That's also another interesting way to bring the life to, one of the downsides to working off of a written statement is it takes you very into the kind of left brain analytical wordsmithing place. And that can sometimes suck the life out. And when those are easy to get into rabbit hole discussions and get really bogged down in the minutia, and you can just feel the energy drain out of the room because people have, resonate with different language. I just had that earlier this week. And so I think you can mix and match too and augment that with using some drawing or getting a group up and moving and really stoking some energy. And I think one of the things I appreciate around the language of compelling purpose, it's not just a purpose, but it's a purpose that's compelling and that really ignites and inspires. And I think sometimes you may need to use some different methods or some of the art to really to ignite that fire.
I certainly agree with you. And, when you think about the characteristics of a compelling purpose, one of them is clear, meaning you would know what success looks like if you were to accomplish it. And, there's the very dry sort of goal setting and identifying metrics way of being clear, but there's also draw a picture of the way the world will be different, or something that matters to you will be different if this team accomplishes its purpose. And you're right, that engages a much more imaginative aspect of the brain that I think also brings that other aspect of compelling to life, which is the consequentiality. It gets them thinking, imagining, and literally picturing the kinds of differences that the team could actually make if they succeed.
But it's also, I think, for the group, the actual task of creating the pictures together or the metaphor or whatever the physical movements is in and of itself an act of creation together, right? Co-creating together. And that, I think, is part of this. It's about really unlocking our collective ability to create meaningful purposes and futures together. And so I think it's not just the end result of getting the clear purpose and compelling purpose, but the act of creating the purpose also has this, I think, effect on the team really coming together and sharing that and feeling a commitment to it, right? So
not incidentally, getting them into work together that way gives us as coaches material to work with.
Exactly.
Right? Because very often you can see a team at its best when they get into that, and you can bring to their attention the many things that they are actually doing well.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I like to say is the system reveals itself. So the way they act in accomplishing the task mirrors the way they act in real life. So you get to see, so I will give them a task and just fade to the background and, really just bite my tongue and bite my, coaching interventions and let them work a bit to see if the system will emerge, and it always does. So let's talk a little bit about right people. I think in the original framework, when you had 5 conditions, right people was part of one of the other conditions, but you split that out. And I really appreciate that, because I think we're living at a time where, technical expertise really matters. And, we need to highlight what are the skill sets. It's great if we need to be a real team and we have a compelling purpose, but are we actually fit for purpose in the sense of, do we have the skills to do the work? And not just the technical skills or leadership skills, but really the teamwork skills, right? That we need people who actually can collaborate together, who can lead, follow, et cetera. So what comes up for you as you think about working with teams around the right people?
Well,
condition?
2 things. One that I've been thinking about, the reason that we draw the 3 essentials as a triangle is because they are so interrelated with each other. So if the purpose shifts, then the question of, do we have the right people working on this together, also has to be revisited. So, I've told you there are these multi-sector, multi-stakeholder groups that I've been working with who have purposes that are around transforming health at a regional level. And so many of these teams around the U.S. are coming together. They're coming together on a voluntary basis. They're leaders from different organizations, and they may have a purpose that is about really dealing with the important drivers of health, but oftentimes they've come together from the health care system, those who provide sickness care and rescue from illness. And as they develop insight into their purposes and realize that some of the most important drivers of health are not in the healthcare system, they're in the environment, they're in the social determinants of health, they begin to have to think about the question of, do we have the right set of experiences and perspectives around the table to actually accomplish that? And the answer is almost inevitably, nope, we've got to broaden the definition of the people who can really contribute to a purpose like that and expand the table that's involved in that.
I love that.
And just on those teams for a minute, you mentioned the teamwork skills as being another important aspect of it. One of the things that we see across the board in many different kinds of teams is a pretty refined emphasis on what perspectives, capabilities, skills are needed to do the work, but not very much attention to selecting on the basis of demonstrable ability to work with other people effectively. Like that's sort of left out of the selection process. And a lot of times these multi-sector leadership teams that we're dealing with, those leaders haven't gotten to the positions of senior authority in their enterprises because they're great team players. Very often they have gotten there for other reasons entirely. And so the ability to empathize with others and deal with others in a collective decision-making process in a really effective way is not really present in the skill set of all of those individuals. And that actually winds up needing some attention and support as well.
What I love about this conversation, what I've been finding with the teams that I've been working with, a lot of times the team exists in the org chart and then we come together for a design session. But when we get really clear about the compelling purpose and even more granular, what are the must-win battles or mission-critical tasks that team's really going to be focusing on in the short term to start to realize that purpose, that really creates a real clear context then to look at, so what skills would we need? And one of our colleagues, Gabe Abella, taught me a great technique for helping a team really grapple with identifying the clusters of skills you need, but then using some constellations to identify where are we in terms of our skill level on those skills as a team, individually and collectively as a team, but also what's our interest around those skills? Because sometimes people get tapped because they have the skill, but they're getting tired of always being the one that holds up that corner of the team. And so I think there's an interesting way to really start to look then at what are the skills we're going to need in the team. And to your point, do we actually have on the team the diversity of perspectives to be able to do this work and the skills? That also, I think, really sets up a great opportunity to start bringing in some group coaching and individual coaching of the individual members. Like, who do we need to be successful on this team? And every team is not going to have 100% of all that you need. So I think this really sets up an opportunity for what is the development and learning we're going to need to do. So it's a little bit of forecasting, I think, some of that when we start to identify. We probably have a lot of the skills and perspectives we need. What are the gaps? Do we need to augment our team then with new people or additional people? Or is there a developmental part of that journey?
Yeah, I think, we started with the question today about your best opportunities to help leaders and teams get the essentials in place. And, I'm reflecting that, there are multiple ways to help teams ensure that they have the right people. There's selection, right? There's identifying the people who have the capacities, including teamwork skills. And one of my favorite illustrations of that is the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, which, as you know, is it's about 40 years old now, and it has been playing without a conductor in all of that time. And the players in the orchestra collectively do the role of music director or conductor. So they are collectively making decisions about musical interpretation, offering visions of the piece, offering ideas about how to interpret and play it. And it requires a very high degree of collaborative skill and maturity to offer and try and have your ideas rejected and then be open to hearing something from somebody else. And the way that they have ensured that they have that high level of leadership and teamwork capacity is that players who want to join the orchestra play with them. They actually play with them as substitutes for some period of time before they would be given an invitation to join the team. So they take that selection aspect of it very, very seriously. So selection, of course, is always one way that you can get the right people on the team. There's also deselection, which is obviously much more emotionally tricky. It's shifting the composition of the team or taking people off the team that, once we've got our purpose clear, it's not clear that you're somebody that can contribute to that. And we have lots of illustrations of how, senior leaders have dealt with that in their leadership teams by, for example, reforming and relaunching, usually with a new name, a team that has a different configuration with a revised and compelling purpose. But there's no question that is one of the significant emotional challenges around this essential condition, which is when you've done a clear assessment of whether you've got the right people to contribute to the purpose, how do you handle the changes in membership and the shift in boundaries of the team? So I'm just wondering if that comes up in your practice and how you think about some ways to help teams and leaders with that.
Yeah, what I've been trying to help them get to, and I go back to this idea of the must-win battles and the mission-critical tasks. So when we get clear around what does the shorter-term work looks like, it brings it down to a level of concrete, some concreteness that I think is helpful, because then maybe if you start to think about, so over the next 3 or 4 months, what are the core things we're working on? Who on our team? Do we need everybody on the team? Or who's most essential? And how to best leverage our talent? And I think looking at sort of the right people and the compelling purpose as something that's fluctuating and shifting is one of the things I've been trying to introduce to teams, that maybe you need all hands on deck for these couple of priorities that you're working on. Or is there another way to use your talent and or augment even temporarily some members from other teams or who you need to do this work? And so that's the kind of thing I've been trying to inject in and let them, grapple with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then of course you also have raised the third method around the right people, which is acknowledging our imperfections and putting in place a development plan so that, let's assume for the moment we are the right people and there are some missing capacities that we need to find, either with temporary members, as you say, but also by developing the capacities of the individuals who are in the team and thinking about how to build those capabilities that they will need.
One link up just from a story from earlier this week. I had a team that measured themselves highly on right people. So they had the team members that they thought they needed, but when they looked at how they were leveraging their talent, this shows up in the key task processes, which we'll talk about in another episode. They feel like that was the lowest rated dimension. So they weren't really using their talent well enough. So there is some kind of flow through about how, the right people box is really critical, but then how are you leveraging the talent you have becomes an ongoing emergent, phenomenon to deal with. I see that we're burning daylight on this episode, Ruth, and there's a lot of great topics that I'd love to just rip off on. One of them is really around authority structures and teams. You spoke about Orpheus, which I think is a self-designing and a self-managing team. And so I think that'll be for another topic, because I think that starts to layer in other interesting ways of grappling with some of these challenges. Are you a leader-led team? Are you a self-managing team, a self-designing team, or a self-governing team? That's coming up for me. I think we'll also probably in the next episode be talking about the enabling conditions. And one of the things about right people that comes up for me is the large sizes of the teams that I'm coming across, and the desire to be inclusive. We include everybody in the team. And, once you start getting teams that are into the high teens or 20s or even 30s, you start to really create lots of challenges for yourself about how do we actually, are those the right people for the mission critical tasks we need to do? And, how do we grapple with the inclusion and, the impossibility of getting consensus in such large groups? So, I think this sets us up for some interesting follow-on conversations in the upcoming episodes.
So in preparation for our next episode, two things. One is I'm wondering if you have a particular favorite resource that you would want to bring to the attention of our listeners if they want to explore more deeply about the essentials and how to help teams with those.
Well, I love your book, Ruth. So the Senior Leadership Team's book, I think, is a great read. That's one of my favorites. So I'll make that plug there for you. And that's kind of one of my go-to areas. But, I think, as I draw on other books out there, I go back to The Wisdom of Teens by Katzenbach. I think some of these themes are showing up in different models, even Peter Hawkins' work on systemic team coaching. There's some good resources there. So I think it's positive, and we see across the different schools of thought or people thinking about teams, there's some overlap that we're finding similar phenomenon that are critical to get into place. So I think those are a couple of the ones that just immediately come to my mind. But yeah, how about for you?
Well, I'd just like to issue an invitation to listeners who are curious about this to explore our advanced practitioner workshop, because just working with you around the things that you have developed to bring to life that question of real team and to bring stakeholders into the room, I think has been incredibly inspiring for a lot of practitioners to begin bringing that kind of work into their practice. So I would just make a pitch to think about the Advanced Practitioner Certification, which is our 2-day face-to-face workshop, and working around the 6 conditions and the team diagnostic survey.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a place where we're just playing with lots of different tools. And I think what we love about that is we've brought a lot of tools to the table, but we're constantly learning new tools as well, and just building out a great set of resources around working in creative ways, a wide range of ways. I don't think there's a right way, again, to coach teams around these things, but we've been developing a resource kit around that. So
yeah, and it's so great to explore those with practitioners who have their own great stuff that they bring to the table. I learn so much every time.
Yeah, and maybe that's a nice way to end this episode. That I think working in this space of teams is really challenging, and that's what probably gets us all excited. But it's really great to be part of a community of practice and really share ideas and resources and things that work or don't work. And together, I think as a larger learning community, we can become much more effective together than trying to do this working separately in parallel. So
yeah, thanks, Krister. Yeah. So just an intro to our next episode, and as always, we'll pitch you a reflection question to be thinking about coming into the next one. Our next episode will be on the 3 enabling conditions, and we wanted to pose a question to you to reflect on about one of the 3 enablers. How would you go about helping a team to develop healthy norms and work practices? So what do you think is the most powerful way you could help a team develop healthy norms and work practices? And thank you for joining us today on episode 4, and we look forward to seeing you in episode 5, where we'll tackle the enabling conditions.
Great. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. For show notes, links to great resources mentioned in the podcast, and for more information, go to 6teamconditions.com. See you next time on the 6 Conditions Podcast.